the hospital in what we both knew were his final weeks, my father held my hand, the hand he hadn't held in years, and said, "She told me you didn't want to see me. Every time. For 9 years. She said you were too busy, that you'd said cruel things about me, that you'd chosen your own life over your father. And I believed her, Alina. God forgive me, I believed her. It was never true, was it?" And I had to tell my dying father that no, it had never been true, that I had never stopped trying to reach him, and that the woman he'd married had spent 9 years making sure my every attempt disappeared before it reached him. Let me back up. Because to understand how a father and daughter, who once adored each other, became strangers, you have to understand the woman who came between them, and the patience of what she did, and the specific, quiet cruelty of stealing a living parent from his child, not with a single blow, but with 9 years of small, invisible poison. My name is Alina Marsh. I'm 42 years old, and my stepmother spent 9 years systematically turning my father against me and my brother, isolating him from his own children, until a man who had loved us completely stopped speaking to us entirely. And I only learned the truth of what she'd done when my father was dying, and the poison finally wore off. He asked me why I'd abandoned him when I never had. This is the story of those 9 stolen years, the woman who stole them, and the terrible, precious reckoning at the end. Let me tell you about my father first, and about who we were before, because the loss only makes sense against the love. My father, Gerald, was, for the first 30-odd years of my life, the warmest presence in it. My mother and he raised my brother Daniel and me in a house full of love, and my father was the heart of it. Funny, gentle, endlessly proud of his kids, the dad who showed up, who paid attention, who made each of us feel like the most important person in the world. I was, unashamedly, a daddy's girl. My father and I had a bond that I thought was unbreakable, the kind of bond that no force on earth could come between. I was wrong about the unbreakable part, not because the bond was weak, because I underestimated what patient, sustained malice could do to even the strongest bond, given enough time and enough access. My mother died when I was 31. Cancer, slow and cruel, and it devastated all of us, my father most of all. He and my mother had been married 35 years, and her death left him hollowed out, lost, adrift in a grief he didn't know how to navigate. And my brother and I, grieving ourselves, rallied around him, held him up, got him through the worst of it. For about a year after Mom died, the three of us were closer than ever, bound by shared loss. And then Gloria arrived. My father met Gloria about 18 months after my mother died. He was 63, lonely, still grieving, vulnerable in the specific way that widowers are desperate for warmth, for companionship, for someone to fill the enormous silence my mother had left. And Gloria filled it. She was attentive, warm, adorably present, and my father, drowning in loneliness, reached for her like a life raft. They married within a year of meeting. I want to be fair and say that at first I was glad. I didn't want my father to be alone. If Gloria made him happy, I was prepared to love her for it. My brother and I welcomed her, genuinely, because our father's happiness mattered more to us than any reservation. But Gloria did not want to be welcomed into our family. Gloria wanted to replace it. Here is what I came to understand, far too late. Gloria was a particular kind of person, one who could not tolerate sharing the person she'd attached herself to. She needed to be the center of my father's world, the sole occupant of his heart, and my brother and I, his children, his existing loves, the people who'd been there before her, were not family to be joined. We were competition to be eliminated. And Gloria set about eliminating us with a patience and skill that I still, even now, find chilling. Let me describe the mechanics, because the horror of it is in the slowness, in how each step was too small to fight. It started with subtle wedges. Gloria would relay to my father small, invented slights, that I'd said something dismissive about him, that Daniel had complained about him, that we didn't really respect him. Tiny poisons, each one deniable, each one calibrated to wound a grieving man's fragile sense of being loved. And she'd do the reverse to us, tell us subtly that our father was hurt by us, disappointed, pulling away, so that we felt a growing distance we couldn't explain and blamed ourselves for. Then she controlled the access. This was the crucial mechanism. Gloria made herself the gatekeeper of my father, the one who managed his calendar, answered his phone, relayed his messages. And she used that position to intercept. When I called, she'd say he was busy, resting, didn't want to talk. When I invited them to things, she'd decline on his behalf, or accept and then cancel, or simply not tell him I'd invite them. When I reached out, my outreach vanished into Gloria and never reached my father, and my father experienced only silence from me. A silence Gloria then explained to him. See how she never calls? See how she doesn't care? And to me, when I did reach my father directly, something was always off, a coolness, a hurt, a distance, because Gloria had been filling his ears with my supposed cruelties, and he was reacting to a version of me she'd invented. Our real interactions became strained and confusing, and every strained interaction was more evidence, in Gloria's ongoing narrative, that his children had turned against him. Over 9 years, this compounded. 9 years of intercepted calls, invented slights, canceled plans, redirected affection, patient poison. And it worked, because it was relentless, and because Gloria controlled the information environment my father lived in. Let me give you one specific call, because it stands for 100 of them, and because I didn't understand what I was hearing until years later. It was maybe year 4. Called my father on his birthday. Gloria answered, as she always did. "Oh, Alina," she said, warm as anything. "He's just lying down, he's had a hard day, but it's so sweet of you to call. I'll tell him you called." And I said, please, could I just say happy birthday, even for a minute? And Gloria's voice cooled by a single degree, a degree only I could hear, and she said, "Alina, I don't want to upset him on his birthday. You know how things have been. Maybe it's better not today." And I backed off, because I didn't want to upset him either, and I hung up thinking I'd done the loving thing. Here is what I learned years later from Uncle Sal. My father spent that birthday sad and quiet, and when Sal asked him why, my father said, "Neither of my kids even called on my birthday." He didn't know I'd called. Gloria never told him. She'd taken my birthday call, my warm, loving, happy birthday call, and she converted it, in the space of one phone conversation, into fresh evidence of my neglect. I had called. He was told I hadn't. And the "I'll tell him you called" was the exact mechanism of the theft. A promise to relay love that she simply never kept, 100 times over 9 years, each broken promise becoming, in my father's mind, one more instance of a child who didn't care. That's how you steal a father, not with a dramatic lie, with a warm voice on the phone saying, "I'll tell him you called," and then the silence where the telling should have been. I gave her 9 years of love to deliver to my father. She delivered none of it, and told him the absence was mine. Slowly, my warm, loving father, the man who'd made me feel like the most important person in the world, became distant, then cold, then absent. He stopped returning my calls because Gloria told him I never called. He stopped coming to family events because Gloria told him we didn't really want him there. He believed, increasingly, that his children had abandoned him for our own lives, because that was the story Gloria told him every single day, and he had no counter-narrative, because Gloria had cut off the source of the counter-narrative, which was us. By the end, my father and I didn't speak at all, a relationship that had been the anchor of my life simply ended, not in a fight, not in a rupture, but in a slow fade orchestrated by a woman who needed him to have no one but her. Let me tell you what that did to me, because the estate, the money that came later and mattered less. What Gloria stole first was my father, while he was still alive. And there's a specific agony to losing a living parent, to knowing he's out there, a few miles away, breathing, thinking, but lost to you, believing lies about you, no longer loving you, and you can't fix it because you can't even reach him. It's a grief with no funeral, no closure, no end. I grieved my father for 9 years while he was still alive, and the grief was worse than my mother's death in one specific way. My mother's death wasn't anyone's fault, and I got to say goodbye. This was deliberate, and there was no goodbye, just a door slowly closing, held by a woman who smiled as she closed it. Let me tell you about the subplot that eventually helped crack it. My father's older brother, my Uncle Sal. Uncle Sal was my father's brother and oldest friend, and he was one of the few people Gloria couldn't fully cut off, because he was persistent and thick-skinned and had known my father for 70 years. And Sal saw what was happening. He'd watched Gloria isolate my father, watch the man withdraw from his own children, and unlike everyone else, who mostly accepted the story that Gerald's kids had drifted away, Sal didn't buy it. He knew my father. He knew how much Gerald had loved us. And he refused to believe that love had simply evaporated. Sal kept a channel open. He'd visit my father sometimes, getting past Gloria's gatekeeping through sheer stubbornness, and he'd quietly tell me how my father really was. And quietly tell my father the truth about us when he could, that we did love him, that we were trying to reach him, that whatever Gloria was saying wasn't true. Sal was a small, persistent counterforce against Gloria's 9-year campaign. He couldn't undo it. Gloria's access was too total, but he kept a thread alive, and he kept, crucially, his own observations. Sal watched, and Sal remembered, and Sal would later be a witness to everything. Now let me tell you about the midpoint, the failed reconciliation, because I did try, and the trying made it worse before it made it better. About 6 years in, I made a determined effort to break through. I refused to accept the estrangement. I forced my way back into contact, showed up, insisted on seeing my father. And for a brief window, it seemed to work. My father and I had a few real conversations. Some of the old warmth flickered back, and I thought maybe I could pull him out of Gloria's fog. But Gloria saw the threat, and she escalated brutally. She fed my father a new, sharper set of lies, that my sudden reappearance was self-interested, that I only wanted something from him, that I was manipulating him. And she engineered a confrontation, twisting something I'd said into an insult, presenting it to my father in the worst possible framing, so that the brief reconciliation collapsed into a worse rupture than before. Let me tell you how that collapse actually happened, because the craft of it still takes my breath away. During those few good weeks, I'd mentioned to my father, warmly, in passing, that I worried about him, that I wanted to make sure he was okay, that if he ever needed anything he could come to me. An ordinary loving thing a daughter says. And Gloria took it. She went to my father and told him that I'd been saying he was losing it, that I thought he couldn't take care of himself, that I was circling, positioning to control him and his money, that my sudden concern was a grab. She took, "I want to make sure you're okay," and rendered it as, "She thinks you're incompetent and she's after your money." And she did it in my father's most vulnerable place, his fear as an aging widower of being seen as helpless, of being managed, of being a burden. The next time I saw him, he was cold in a way that frightened me. And when I asked what was wrong, he said, "I know what you're doing, Elena. I'm not senile. I don't need you swooping and acting concerned so you can take over my life. Gloria told me what you've been saying about me." And I said, "Dad." I never said any of that. I just said, "I love you, and I want you to be okay." And I watched him not believe me, watch Gloria's version sit in his eyes as the truth and my actual words bounce off. And I understood that I was not talking to my father. I was talking to a man Gloria had built, and the real Gerald was somewhere underneath, unreachable, behind 9 years of wall. He told me with a coldness that broke my heart that he didn't want to see me anymore, that I'd hurt him for the last time. And the door, which I'd pried open a crack, slammed shut harder than ever. Gloria had not just reclosed it. She'd taken my love and used it as the weapon to close it, turned the very act of my reaching out into proof of the things she'd accused me of. That's what made her so hard to fight. She could take anything good I did and reforge it into evidence against me before it ever reached my father clean. That failed reconciliation nearly destroyed me. Because I'd hoped, and the hope had been weaponized against me, and I came away believing that maybe it really was hopeless, that Gloria had won so completely that my father was gone for good. For the last 3 years of the estrangement, I mostly stopped trying, not because I'd stopped loving him, but because every attempt just gave Gloria new material and cost me new wounds. I resigned myself to losing my father while he was still alive. It was the darkest period of my life, and then my father got sick. Here is the reckoning, and it's the most bittersweet thing I'll ever tell. My father was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and it progressed quickly, and as it did, something happened that Gloria could not prevent. It changed the circumstances of his care and his isolation. He was hospitalized, and a hospital is not a house Gloria controlled. In the hospital, there were doctors, nurses, other people, and there was Uncle Sal, who came immediately and stayed, and who made sure that when my father was lucid and asking questions, the answers weren't only Gloria's. And Sal called me. "Alina," he said, "your father is dying. And he's been asking about you. Really asking, not the way Gloria's trained him, but asking, confused, like a man waking up. I think the sickness, or being out of that house, or just facing the end, something's cutting through her fog. You need to come. Now. Before it's too late, and before she can stop you." I went. And Gloria tried to stop me, tried to bar me from the hospital, tried to tell my father I'd come to upset him, deployed every tool of her 9-year campaign. But a dying man in a hospital has rights his wife can't fully override, and Sal was there, and the medical staff were there, and I got to my father's bedside. And the man I found was, for the first time in 9 years, my father again. Because whether it was the imminence of death, or the removal from Gloria's controlled environment, or simply the way dying strips away everything false, the fog was lifting. He looked at me, and there was recognition and confusion, and a dawning horror as the reality reassembled itself in his mind. And he held my hand, the hand he hadn't held in years, and he said the words that both broke and saved me. "She told me you didn't want to see me, every time, for 9 years. She said you were too busy, that you'd said cruel things about me, that you'd chosen your own life over your father. And I believed her, Alina. God forgive me, I believed her. It was never true, was it? And I told my dying father the truth. That no, it had never been true. That I had never stopped trying to reach him. That every call he'd been told I didn't make, I made. That every visit he'd been told I didn't want, I wanted. That the cruel things he'd been told I said, I never said. That I had loved him every single day of the 9 years he believed I'd abandoned him, and that the silence he'd experienced as my rejection had been Gloria, standing between us, making sure my love never reached him. My father wept. Dying man, weeping at the discovery that the estrangement that had shadowed his final decade had been a lie, that his daughter had loved him all along, that he'd been turned against his own child by the woman he trusted. It was the worst and most important conversation of my life. Here is how it ended, and it ended in a reconciliation that was real and precious and far too short. My father had, it turned out, a period of lucid time before the end, weeks, not long, but real. And in those weeks, freed from Gloria's fog, he did several things. He reconciled with me, and with Daniel truly, completely, the old warmth flooding back, compressed into the little time we had. It got our father back for a few weeks, which is both a miracle and a cruelty, because a few weeks after 9 stolen years is not enough, will never be enough, and yet it was everything. And my father, understanding now what Gloria had done, acted on it. With Uncle Sal's help and his own returning clarity, he consulted a lawyer outside Gloria's control, and he addressed the estate. Because Gloria's campaign, I should say, had a financial dimension I haven't dwelt on. Over the 9 years, she'd not only isolated my father emotionally, but had steered his estate toward herself, positioning to inherit everything while his children, conveniently estranged, were written out. My father. In his final lucid weeks corrected this, restructured his estate to provide for his children, as he'd always in his true heart intended, and to limit what Gloria could take with documentation of his clear intent, and his sound mind witnessed and lawyered so Gloria couldn't overturn it. But the estate was, again, the smallest part. The largest part was the truth, spoken and received before the end. My father died knowing his children had never abandoned him. And my brother and I got to say goodbye to our real father, not the stranger Gloria had made, but Gerald, the warm man who'd loved us completely, restored to us for a few precious weeks at the very end. Gloria's role in his final days collapsed once the truth was out. My father, lucid, saw her clearly at last, and it's a small brutal mercy that he got to, that he didn't die inside her lie, but outside it, knowing what she'd done. Whether her manipulation and estate steering crossed into anything legally actionable, we pursued as far as was worth pursuing. The documentation my father left, and Uncle Sal's witness to 9 years of Gloria's gatekeeping and lies, made her position untenable, and she did not inherit as she'd schemed to. But no legal outcome could return the 9 years. Those were simply gone, stolen, unrecoverable. Uncle Sal is the hero of this story, if it has one. A stubborn brother who never believed the lie, who kept a thread alive across 9 years, who called me at the end when it mattered most, who witnessed everything and made sure the truth could surface. Without Sal, my father would have died inside Gloria's fog, believing his children had abandoned him, and I would have lived the rest of my life without the reconciliation that, however brief, healed something I thought could never be healed. Sal gave me my father back at the end. I'll be grateful to him until I die. For 9 years, my stepmother turned my father against his own children, not with a single blow, but with patient, invisible poison, intercepting my every attempt to reach him, filling his grieving heart with invented cruelties. Until a man who had adored me believed I'd abandoned him and stopped speaking to me at all. She stole the hardest thing to steal and the hardest theft to prove. A living father from his daughter, one small lie at a time, over 9 years, Each lie too small to fight, the whole campaign too slow to see until the damage was done. I grieved my father while he was still alive. I lost him to a lie and had no way to reach him through it. And I had made my peace, in the darkest way, with the likelihood that he would die believing I'd abandoned him, that the last thing my father would ever feel about me was the ache of a rejection that never happened. But my father got sick. And dying, it turns out, has a way of burning off fog. In a hospital Gloria couldn't control, with a brother who never stopped fighting for the truth, my father woke up, and he reached for my hand, and he asked me the question that had been buried under 9 years of poison. It was never true, was it? No, Dad. It was never true. I loved you every single day. Every call you were told I didn't make, I made. Every visit you were told I didn't want, I wanted. I never left. She just stood between us and made sure you never knew I was still there. We got a few weeks. After 9 stolen years, we got a few weeks of my real father back, and they were not enough, and they were everything, and I would not trade them for anything in this world. She spent 9 years making sure my father died, believing his daughter had abandoned him. She failed by 3 weeks. And 3 weeks, it turns out, was just enough time for a dying man to learn that he had been loved all along, and for a daughter to get her father back, just long enough to say the goodbye that a 9-year lie had almost stolen forever. Got to hold his hand at the end, the hand she'd kept from me for 9 years, and when he died, he knew. He knew I'd never left. That's what Sal gave me and what Gloria couldn't take in the end. My father died knowing the truth. It cost 9 years to reach him, but the truth reached him. It always, eventually, does, sometimes just barely in time.